This is the Danger Close podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr. Welcome to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. My next book, In the Blood, is coming May 17th. That's a date change from May 31st. So it's coming in early, coming in hot, May 17th, available for pre-order now. My guest today is Ryan Holiday. I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and you'll see why once you get into the podcast. But Ryan Holiday is the author of The Daily Stoic, Obstacle is the Way, a host of other books on Stoicism, a few on marketing, just an amazing guy. You can follow him on the social channels at Daily Stoic. You can go to his website, ryanholiday.net, and sign up for his daily newsletter. Just an incredible guy. And well, without further ado, let's get after it. Ryan Holiday. Stephen Pressfield introduced us, it's been a couple of years ago.
I know, man. You've written a couple books.
Yeah, it's been a crazy few years, which is why I'm going to do my best not to turn this into a therapy session.
All right. I could use one, so I wouldn't mind.
Oh, I don't know. You've got it. You've got things. You've got the book right here. You've got that. I want to ask you all about that and everything that you have going on. All these multiple books, you're doing so many great things for people. I've signed up for the newsletter. My wife has signed up for the newsletter. We get them every morning. And I think you're just doing so much good for the country right now.
Well, I appreciate that, man.
Oh, absolutely. And if more people would sign up for that daily email, and if more people would read your books and read Marcus Aurelius as well, and we'd be all better off for it. That's there's no doubt about that.
Well, I agree at least about the Marcus Aurelius part. I wish more people would read him, and I wish he was taught in schools.
That's it. That's a huge part of it right there, because I didn't find him until college, which I think is where you did as well. Mm-hmm. But I was introduced to him through someone who started to teach me how to think logically. And up until that point, no one had ever mentioned that to me. It's just been school and you're memorizing. Of course, I'm really into history because of the military side of the house, but I have to do some math and some other things in there as well. But no one had ever taught us how to think. And that is such an important thing to learn how to do to make you a good human.
I think so. I was just reading this article this morning that the headline was, "How do we know that reality is not a hallucination?" Right? And it was interesting. And I think that's what people think philosophy is about, right? They think philosophy is these like unanswerable questions, like how do we know that there is such a thing as right or wrong? Or what if we live in a computer simulation? Or do you know what the trolley problem is?
No.
The trolley problem is this, it's like one of the most vexing ethical questions in philosophy, which is like, there's a track and the track diverges. And if it goes in one direction, it will run over one person. And if it goes in another direction, it will run over five people. Now, do you stop it? Right? Or do you direct it to run over 1 versus 5? Or do you keep your hands clean and just let it do what it's going to do? Right? And then does it change if you know one of the people, or, the point is, it's supposed to be a vexing ethical question to which there's actually not an answer. And what I love about Stoicism and the kind of philosophy that I think about is that although there might be a time and a place for those questions, Stoicism to me is so much more practical. It's like, how do you prevent yourself from losing your temper, right? Like, how do you endure adversity? How do you prioritize the right things in life? I guess what I like about Stoicism is that it's logical, but not. Sometimes we can use logic almost to get to a very illogical place where we can't actually do anything with the information. Do you know what I mean?
Interesting. Well, I do like that trolley problem because, man, if you had some optics with you on that train, you could do a quick little scan and see if some of those people needed to be run over. Yes. Terrible thing to say, but there are some people in the world that it might be a better place without them.
It unfortunately is true. Yeah.
So you drop out of college and you apprentice under Robert Greene. He's the author of 48 Laws of Power. And I have not read that book, but I have seen it in every airport bookstore that I've walked into over the last 20 years. And I am sure. And it's a thick book. Like it's not messing around. But I have not purchased it yet, and I probably should now that I see how much of an influence he was, and it has been on you. But can you describe what was that process like of dropping off and meeting him and going to apprentice for him?
I think you would love the 48 Laws of Power. I think you'd love his book, The 33 Strategies of War, even more, which is sort of his fusing of Sun Tzu and Machiavelli and all the sort of great generals and strategists in history. Robert is, I think, maybe the greatest living nonfiction author, just like the greatest of all time. He sold millions of books. But his books are really practical. Like his books are popular with world leaders, but they're also one of the most stolen books in the country. Like people who don't read shoplift them from bookstores. They're also so popular in the federal prison system that many prisons have banned them because they didn't like how the prisoners were using them. The point being, I think Robert takes really big ideas and makes them very accessible and practical. So you read one of his books and it's like reading 20 or 30 much more difficult books, all compressed down into one. And so growing up, that was the author, his books hit me really hard. And they opened my eyes up to that was even a thing, that a person could write that way. And so to get the opportunity to not just meet him, but to learn how he does what he does, it was just a huge breakthrough in my life and my career. I mean, I'm sure you found this when you sat down to write your first book. Obviously, you liked reading and you had something you wanted to write, but like how to actually do it, it's so hard. It's a totally different skill set that you really can't like learn in school. And so to have someone who has been there before you showing you how it works, it was just, it was a transformative experience for me. I'm a big believer in that sort of apprentice model of learning, where you find the person who's doing what you want and you attach yourself to them, and you learn a lot of things by their experiences as opposed to having necessarily to learn them all by your own painful experiences.
Yep. No, there's so much to that. That's why I think it's so valuable when people are leaving. Well, anything can be anything in life, but my experience is with the military. So leaving and having seen so many people have a tough time with that transition, but being able through your last year where you're essentially in the military, you're walking around, you're going to dental, you're going to medical, you're standing in line to make appointments, you're getting read out of secret programs, you're turning in gear. So your last year can be used probably a little more efficiently if they gave you some time to go apprentice in a couple different areas, intern in a couple different areas, just to make sure that maybe you really want to be a lawyer after you saw the one movie or you saw the TV show, and now you're going to devote these 3 years to law school, and then you're going to be in a firm or whatever it's going to be. Well, before you waste all that time, maybe spend 2 months there, 1 month, 3 months interning or as an apprentice for someone, so you can say, oh, this is not for me. This is not what I thought it was going to be. And maybe in the course of doing that 3 or 4 times in places that interest you or in fields that interest you, maybe you're going to find that thing that you find your passion and be able to, or you already know it, but you just don't know where to direct it. And you'll be able to find that spot and go.
Well, it's so funny so I was Robert's research assistant for many years. And I also had a career in marketing. I was the director of marketing in a company called American Apparel. And when I decided I was going to transition out of that into writing, I went to Robert and I said, look, like, I want to be a writer. I want to actually do this. And for a bunch of reasons, I had about a year left that I had to spend at American Apparel. There's projects to finish, a bunch of stuff going on. And I just wasn't ready. And Robert actually compared it. He's like, let's say you were enlisted and you had a year left in your contract. He's like, how you spend this year is going to be everything. Because he's like, look, you can just show up for work every day and not think about the future. Just show up and then when you leave, start being a writer. He's like, or you can say, hey, my education is being subsidized for the next year, right? He's like, you can meet everyone that you can meet. You can do as much research as you can. You can do as much reading as you can. You can develop as many relationships as you can. And he said he was like, and actually I wrote this down. I have it on a card in my on my wall in the other room. He said there's two types of time in life. There's a live time and dead time. And dead time is when you're just waiting around. You're like, oh, the flight's delayed 3 hours, and so I'm just going to sit here, right? Alive times is like, I'm going to read a book, or I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to leave the airport and I'm going to catch a cab into the city and see someone and come right back. Or, a lifetime, he says, is when you're actually living and breathing every minute that you're awake and you're putting that time to good use. And I think we've seen this during the pandemic, right? People were like, oh, it's just 2 weeks. Like, I'll wait it out. Well, here we are like 2 years later. If you're still waiting for things to go back to normal, that means you've wasted 2 years of your life that large things might have been outside your control. Maybe you couldn't travel in certain ways, or you couldn't open certain kinds of businesses or do a bunch of different things. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't have used 2 years of a lifetime and had a whole bunch to show for this period. So I think about that always, a lifetime, dead time. And I think about what a tragedy it is that people waste time waiting for the next thing instead of doing what they can right now with what's in front of them.
I know it's so sad to think about all those missed opportunities, just because people have been conditioned, or maybe they're just not aware. And a lot of the reason people aren't aware is because I think that we've lost a generation of readers, because we're slowly losing them. Maybe, as things came in, like more TV and cable TV and gazillion channels, but then of course, internet, and then of course, Facebook, and then Instagram, and all these things and all these distractions. It drives me crazy. I've read to my kids in the crib from the day they got home. Every time I was home, not deployed, not on a training trip. And this one is great too. I've been reading this one with my little
amazing
guy. Yeah, it's awesome. We've read it through. He's read it by himself. I've read it to him, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I'm so glad you're doing this.
I wrote that in March of 2020. I'd had this idea. I was like, I always knew I wanted to do a kid's book about Stoicism. And then all of a sudden, I couldn't travel for speaking. I couldn't, do things in person. And I was like, now is the time. Like, now I can do that. And it was, by the way, also the most consecutive nights that I've ever had at home with my kids. And so I got to, I could write a draft and read it that evening, and then and then work on it the next day, and then read it again that evening. And so that book is something for me. We're talking about a lifetime, dead time. The Boy Who Would Be King is what I got out of the first 3-4 months out of the pandemic that I wouldn't have had if I'd had my choice for things to be, the way that they were before.
Right. No, it's fantastic. The illustrations are great in here. And also it's a hook, because kids that are reading this, they will soon be graduating on to other things, following you on Instagram. That's a great way for kids, especially kids that are on Instagram, to get a little bit more aware of Stoicism, of this philosophy of just a way to live life to its fullest, rather than just be distracted all the time by these bombardments of information and distractions and clicks and everything else. And it just pains me. And the reading side of the house, with what I was going with that with the kids, is that they've grown up now, and they're not grown up, but they're still in the house, obviously. But now they're just distracted by all these other things, and those other things don't include books. And I did my best, and it was like, it drives me crazy, because I was always just naturally drawn to reading. And you talk about this as well. My parents made reading as natural as eating, as getting some exercise, as everything else that we did throughout the day, going to school, whatever it was. Like, reading was just a natural thing that we did. It wasn't this thing that we had to do, or something we had to cram in, or it was just as natural as sitting down to dinner. And it's been like that my entire life. So now, when I was getting out of the military, I took that last year and a half, but I already had this education from these storytellers who I had read growing up, from Tom Clancy, David Morrell, AJ Quinnell, J.C. Pollock, Mark Olden, all these guys that I read growing up. So I had this foundation on which to build and add my own personal experience. But the reading, if I talk about it as much as I possibly can, every opportunity I try to sneak it in there, just how important it is to read. And I know it's important to you as well.
Have you read General Mattis's book?
No, okay. Call Sign Chaos, or is that the other? Yes. So I have not read the whole thing, but I flipped through it in something else I wanted to talk to you about, which is the anti-library, which I love the concept of. And I guess I've been building mine my entire life. So, but does he talk about reading in there as well?
He does, in a couple interesting ways. So first off, he's saying that he feels like the biggest flaw in leadership today is that they don't have enough quiet time for reflection. So they're too busy, right? They have all this information coming at them all the time. They're operating on social media. They're from meeting to meeting, that they're not having enough time to sit and reflect and to think. And I think he says in there that obviously one of the best ways to do that is to read about what you're doing, not the latest New York Times piece, right? Or the latest, Substack newsletter about it, but like somebody really thoughtful who wrote about this from the 10,000 foot view, or wrote about it from the historical point of view, right? And in the book, he says like specifically about your previous line of work, he's like, look, people have been fighting in wars for as long as there have been human beings, but they've been writing about these wars for roughly 5,000 years, right? So we have 5,000 years of books about this line of work. And he's like, it's unconscionable that you would go put people in harm's way, not having first learned as many of those lessons as possible. And he has this brilliant line in the book that I think about all the time. And then I'm going to tell my kids as soon as they're old enough. But he says, look, if you haven't read a lot about what you do, he says, you're functionally illiterate. So it doesn't matter that you can read. It matters whether you've read a lot about this thing. And so I think far too often people go, oh, I could read, or I have read a little bit. But like, no, if you're going to write novels, or you're going to write about philosophy, or you're going to go start a business in this space or that space, you better go read every book possibly related to that field, so you have a broad breadth of knowledge to draw from. You're not just winging it, right? Especially if your family is depending on you, or the random people next to you are depending on you, or if you actually just want to be successful. Winging it is for amateurs, right? You got to actually know your stuff.
Exactly. And growing up, my mom was a librarian, so we grew up with this love of reading books everywhere. And I was studying warfare from a very early age because that's what I was interested in.
Sure.
And there was nothing else to distract me. I mean, we had an Atari 2600 at some point, but you can only play so much Atari 2600 for kids that grew up in the 80s. You know what I'm talking about. So I spent a lot of time in libraries. Did you find yourself
drawing on those lessons, though? I've got to imagine that, like, it would be in moments of stress or difficulty or solving complex problems that something you read when you were 9 years old might have come back to you.
Exactly. Those things. And it's not something you can cram for.
Right.
I mean, so people ask me about becoming an author or whatever else. And, yes, anyone, you can do it, but it certainly helps if you've spent a lifetime reading.
Yes.
And you can, in my case, can have read these different books at different times in my life where it was just so magical because I'm not looking at them through the lens of the previous 20 years. I'm reading it at age 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, where it's just magic in these pages. But the warfare side of the house, I mean, there was only so much you could read back then about special operations. And I think I read everything I could find in the early 80s about insurgencies, counterinsurgencies from Vietnam, anything about warfare I was just reading, but most specifically on terrorism and insurgencies and counterterrorism and this buildup of counterterrorism forces that happened in the late 70s up through the 80s, of course, and continues today. But those lessons, I remember these things that I read in 5th grade. I remember these things I read in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, high school. Some I've reread, some I haven't, but I still remember those lessons, and they've been a foundation for the rest of my life.
When they build on each other, right? So it's like, you read a book about the Civil War when you were 11, and now you understood broadly what happened. And then when you were in high school, you read a book about Abraham Lincoln, and that interconnected with what you understood about the Civil War. And then you were in college and you learned this or that, and then some current event happens. Then there, a new work of scholarship comes out, and it's all building. So one of the things I think people also forget is that they go, "Oh, I'm a slow reader," right? They want to know how to read faster. Well, first off, I think speed reading is a scam. So there's no shortcuts to reading very, very quickly. But if you want to read faster, the only way to do it is to have already read lots of books about that topic, right? So let's say I've read 20, 30 books about the Civil War. If I read some new book about the Civil War, I'm not like poring over every page trying to remember. I'm able to go at a faster clip because I've seen this movie before, right? So I'm reading, but I'm really only reading and looking for new things that I don't know. And so the more you read, the faster you get at reading up to a point. So I think a lot of people, the reason reading feels slow and arduous to them is for the same reason that lifting a light weight is also heavy to them, because they haven't done enough reps of that. But as you get stronger, as you get more informed, your pace quickens and your capacity gets greater.
That's exactly right. You're not seeing something and wondering what's the context, because sometimes authors throw in, they expect you to know something already, and something is in there that is that in context to that the greater whole, the picture of what he's trying to paint or she's trying to paint in that in the work. But if you don't have that context and you're not exactly sure where this fit in there or why this happened, well, then you're at a little bit of a loss, and you're not going to get as much out of that read as you would have otherwise. So yeah, I talk about reading, and you love reading so much that you opened a bookstore of your own, and during COVID, right? Is that how that happened?
So I had started the process of buying this building that I was going to turn into a bookstore in the end of 2019. And I made like the first leap towards doing it in January and February of 2020. And then, it felt like a huge mistake for about 12 months as we just sort of sat there. We didn't feel good about opening. It wasn't possible to open for a while. And, there were some moments where it was like, are people ever going to go in bookstores again? Right. And so it was a definitely a difficult experience, but it also, again, to go to the idea of a lifetime or debt time, it said, okay, well, now we have an extra year to do this. So if we're not going to give up, it means we're going to do it better, right? Because now we have more time. And so, we just really thought about every part of the process, really got some clarity about why we were doing it, what we wanted to accomplish, what it meant to us, what our goals were. And then, here we are about a year or so into business. And I just spent all weekend with a friend. I chopped down a big tree on my ranch, and we disassembled it and we moved it inside the bookstore. So now it looks like there's a 20-foot tree growing out of the floor of the bookstore out into the ceiling. So it's been a really cool, rewarding experience. I just think, I think bookstores, I think not only is reading very important, but bookstores specifically, I think have played a huge role in my life. I don't know about you, but I just remember just going into bookstores as a kid. And some of my favorite things in the world now are just things I randomly stumbled across. I remember the first Louis L'Amour book that I bought as a kid. And I was just like, whoa, this isn't like the boring books my parents are making me read. This is like, this is awesome. And I still love Westerns to this day. And that's because of a chance experience in a bookstore.
Yep. No, exactly. I have so many great memories of going into bookstores with my mom. Anytime we travel, we'd go to the local bookstore or local library. So I have so many great memories of that as a kid. So I'm just so connected to these bookstores. And when you were doing that at the beginning of COVID, of course, my third novel, Savage Sun, is coming out, and bookstores, everybody's kind of scrambling. This is March, April, May timeframe of 2020. And so I wanted to help those bookstores that had no foot traffic and figure out how we're going to do that. So I came up with this with book plates you could only get from certain independent bookstores and send them out there, get them online, and try to push as many people as I possibly could to those bookstores, because it means so much to me, and still does to this day. So I can't wait to visit yours, because I'm so excited that you started one. It's amazing.
Well, did you know Stoicism was actually founded in a bookstore?
No.
So Zeno is the founder of Stoicism. He's a merchant. He basically comes from this long line of merchants. And he's leading a convoy of ships in the Mediterranean. He's a dealer in what they call Tyrian purple, which is a purple dye that would make the cloak of the emperor. Only the richest, most powerful people in Greece and Rome could wear purple. And so he's leading this convoy of ships, and he suffers a shipwreck, and he loses everything. This is before venture capital, before insurance. And he washes up in Athens without a penny to his name. And as he's wandering around the streets, he walks in to a bookstore, and the bookseller is reading Socrates, like doing a reading, just like you and I do book signings today. 2,500 years ago, they were doing books, book readings in bookstores, and he listens to the man reading Socrates, and all of a sudden, this bit of advice that he'd gotten as a young man came back to him. He'd been told that he would become wise when he began having conversations with the dead. And he didn't know what that meant. But then hearing the works of Socrates being read in this bookstore, and Socrates was dead, he realized that books were how we have conversations with the dead, right? you can have a conversation with Ulysses S. Grant or General Sherman or Dwight Eisenhower because they wrote books, right? Like that's how we have conversation. You can talk to Alexander the Great because people wrote books about Alexander the Great. And so he realizes in that bookstore that books, reading, that philosophy is an ongoing conversation with the wisest people who ever lived. And that's what sets him on the journey to become a philosopher. And he would later joke, he said, I made a great fortune when I suffered a shipwreck, because even though he lost everything, it changed the whole direction of his life and then Western civilization as a result of his discoveries.
Oh man, I love that. That's so fantastic. And going back to Mattis for a second, though, I was just thinking that, obviously he has that reputation of being the warrior scholar, the warrior monk, and reading. He's talked about that probably for his entire career. I only knew him, didn't know him, but I met him a couple of times, but only later on when he had the stars on his shoulders. But he's a huge proponent, obviously, of reading. But I can't help but go back to, and I try not to dwell on it too much, but if we had only spent more time in the pages of a few books at 2001 timeframe, things might have turned out a lot differently over this last 20 years. And then to your point of getting too busy and not having enough time to think, the people that do take that time off in the military, maybe they go to war college or postgraduate school or something like that, and then they come back. I mean, this train's already rolling. This huge bureaucracy is already moving, and there's so many other factors at play. But at the very beginning, if we'd spent a little time in Peter Hopkirk's The Great Game, and just read about the British experience in the 1800s and early 1900s, there were some clues there. There's some writings about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, which was not that long ago when you were talking about 2001. We had 10 years of the Soviet experience there to study. We didn't have to go back to Alexander the Great. We didn't have to go back to these guys like that. We could have looked at more recent history and made some more educated decisions. And that's what our senior leadership in the military, or our elected representatives, or even non-elected bureaucrats, that's what they owe, is understanding the nature of the conflict of which we're about to engage and which we're about to commit U.S. forces. But how are you going to do that if you're not reading, if you don't have that foundation?
You know what's incredible? I was just reading this book about Queen Elizabeth II. And your point about recent history, right? We think a lot of these things were a really long time ago, and then we tell ourselves, oh, it's different now, right? And when you study history, you realize that people have always thought that, and they're almost always embarrassingly wrong. But anyways, I was reading this biography of her because she's going to be a character in the book that I'm just finishing now. And the author just offhandedly mentions that as a very young girl, she met a veteran of the British campaign in Afghanistan.
Wow.
Right? So imagine she's probably the only living person to have done that. And then her grandson also fights in Afghanistan.
Wow.
Right? So we think that these things never touch each other, right? That they're so far away. And in fact, history is usually just a couple lifetimes away from being old. I met a guy in Austin before he died. He was the oldest living veteran before he died. His name was Richard Overton. And he was born in 1906, right? He fought in World War II when he was 35, 36, something like that. But to think about, I did the math and I went back and I looked, the oldest living veteran alive when he was born was in the Black Hawk War, which was like 1830, 1840, like Lincoln fought in the Black Hawk War.
Oh my gosh.
And so we often think that these things are so distant, and that we live in the modern world, and that because we have computers or missiles or, fighter jets, that everything is different, and they're not different. They're exactly the same, right? Like it's the Stoics say that history is the same thing happening over and over and over again. It's people making the same mistakes, driven by the same forces, people failing to learn the same lessons, and then we're shocked by it. But I saw a meme the other day. Where it's like, we say history repeats itself. So if you have studied history, that's a terrifying position. Like that's almost a burden of knowledge that you have to carry around, because you know what comes next. If you were familiar with the great influenza in March of 2020, you saw where things were going to go, and you knew that this was going to be brutal and awful, and you knew a lot of the mistakes that people were going to make. And I think your point is a good one. It doesn't have to be that way. It's a tragedy that it is, but if people were more informed, perhaps things would be different.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't help that we're so comfortable, specifically in this country, with all those things you just mentioned, with the internet being to reach out for things. Uber Eats, if I get a little hungry, I
Yeah.
hit the app. We've become so as and generally comfortable, and we have not faced as much adversity as generations past. I think I'm safe in saying that, especially when I think about my grandparents, my great grandparents, both who were alive until not that long ago. But they had stories of obviously the Great Depression. My great grandparents first remembered World War One. They had ties back to coming across the prairie, like all those things. I mean, you expected. Why did they have so many children? Because you expected to lose a few back then, and it's just how life was. It was hard, and it's gotten a little bit less so. But I think that the COVID experience of the last couple years, what we're seeing in Ukraine, we're seeing that, hey, maybe society is not quite as stable as we have been led to believe over this very short period of human history, where
Yeah.
we haven't had to provide the food for our family by going out and getting it, or defend. We've been able to call 911 and didn't have to stand there on the front at the front door of our cabin to defend it. That's a very small part of human history, and I think if more and more people are realizing that society is not as stable maybe as we thought. More stable, obviously, than the rest of human history, but maybe it'd be a good idea to be prepared going forward.
I sort of see it as a double-edged sword. So one, it's like, first off, history isn't fun, right? Like when you when you study history, yeah, it's filled with death and tragedy and loss and stupidity and pointless mistakes. And so living through that is not fun, right? It wasn't fun to live through the Depression, just as it wasn't fun to live through the 1919 pandemic. And so here we are. It's naive to think that history is going to be fun. And the last 20 years of American history are almost preposterously filled with, major destabilizing events. But I think the other thing that should come out of that, or at least I hope we could take a little bit of confidence out of that. Seneca talks about, one of the Stoics, he talks about how he pities the person who has never been through adversity because they don't know what they're capable of. Right. So like you and I, yeah, we'd hear about our grandparents who fought in World War II or who lived through the Depression. We'd go, wow, they were so tough. They got through that. Well, like in 50 years, people will be talking about, this year and last year and the year before it as events like that. Right. And so this is, I think, particularly true for people who haven't had the combat experiences that you have had, because obviously you understand that that's sort of a crucible that shapes and informs a person. But now, all of us, we've all been in the same boat the last 2 years. And it was destabilizing and unprecedented and weird and challenging. And yet, like, we're here, like you made it through, like you lived through a historical event. And that shouldn't surprise you because, as we were just talking about, you're the descendant of people who fought on the plains, who survived the Irish famine, or went through any number of these things. They fled communism, or they settled on in a new country. We're the descendants of those people. We come from an unbroken chain of survivors of the worst things that have ever happened in human history. By literally by definition, we are from an unbroken line of survivors. And that should instill us with at least some confidence. We have what it takes. Often we don't act with what it takes, but we deep down, we're biologically exactly the same as those people. We have what it takes.
Yeah, no, it's awesome, and I think it's our responsibility now to pass that along. Because if we didn't have ancestors that were good at doing those certain things, we would not be here.
That's
We
right.
would have starved to death, or maybe they were good at making friends who could fight, or could farm, or could hunt, or whatever. But
Sure.
regardless, those are the politicians, maybe. But if we hadn't done that, they hadn't been good at those things, we would not be here today. But I love that you said that, because I'm going to talk to my kids about that tonight. About, hey, look what you lived through over the last couple years, of course, because they've had the masks in school. They've had to deal with all this. They've seen, parents, us, other parents, just dealing with these different issues. But putting it framing it that way that you just did, I think would be so healthy for these kids who are just, they're just taking it all in. They're soaking, they're sponges. We might not think they're taking it all in as we're discussing something in the kitchen and they're over there in the living room or whatever it might be, but they're taking it all in. And I try to be cognizant of that, but I love how you framed that. I'm going to pass that along tonight.
Yeah, like I heard in 2020, a lot of parents were calling it like a lost year. They're like, this is a lost year because like virtual school and, they couldn't go up, they couldn't have graduation or they couldn't do this or that. Did you hear your grandma describe 1933 as a lost year? No, you didn't, right? Like not only was it not a lost year, they almost spoke of those experiences fondly, like as transformative. It shaped who they were. So to me, that's really what Stoicism is about, is that we have this choice, right? You can see it as dead time if you want. It's a lost year. It sucks. It's so-and-so's fault. And I've been deprived of something as a result. Or you can be like, here's how we got better as a family over the last year. Here's the books that we read. Here's the road trip that we took, right? Here's the reevaluation of our priorities that we underwent. When I look at the last 2 years, I don't think of the fact that I didn't get to travel to Europe several times the way I normally would, or that what it cost me. I go, look, I had the most consecutive nights in a row with my kids. I think of the road trips that we took. I think of the books that I wrote. I think of the books that I read. I think of the fact that, somehow my marriage is better now than it was before, right? I think, and that didn't just happen. That happened because I said, well, since I can't do this, the positive that I'm going to take from it is going to be this instead. And so we always have that choice. It doesn't feel like it because we're often focused on what we've been deprived of or how unfortunate or unnecessary the situation is. I mean, ideally the pandemic would have been prevented, or ideally the response would have been different. But it wasn't. So what are we going to do about it is ultimately the only thing that we have much of a say over.
Yeah. This is why I love talking to you. This is why I love getting those emails and why everybody should sign up and get those daily emails and follow you on Instagram in particular. That's the one that I'm on more regularly than anything else. But they're fantastic, especially when you talk about things like this, or you frame them through that lens of philosophy, of Marcus Aurelius, of meditations, of Stoicism, and you talk about things that are so important like this, and you make it digestible. Because if somebody might pick this up, and think, oh, this is a little hard to get through. What does this really mean? And I have 1,000 other things going on. But the way you break it down, especially in today's day and age when people are used to getting these things, it's such a great introduction that makes people want to go read this, makes people want to read this one to their kids, makes people want to get this Obstacle is the Way and the Daily Stoic right here, which I'm going through now this year. So you can see my little notes
thank you.
right there. So going through that each and every day, it's digestible, it's doable. It's not something that's unachievable. And I think that's so fantastic that you have, that you've done that. Such a service.
Well, I think I'm sure you found this in your training is the learning it once is one thing, but it's really the daily practice that makes it sort of into the muscle memory or part of your second nature. And so I think so often we think of like even reading, but like the big ideas that we shape our lives around. We go, oh, I heard about that in high school, or I read that in college, or, I heard that in church, or whatever it is. And that's great. The introduction is obviously essential. But to me, the daily practice, how often are you checking back into those things? Mm-hmm. So even me, like obviously this has been, 15 or so years of study of Stoic philosophy for me. But as I was rereading Marcus Aurelius at the beginning of the pandemic, because the world had changed so much, I got totally different things out of it, right? So like I knew vaguely, not vaguely, more than vaguely, I understood intellectually that Marcus Aurelius lived during what we now call the Antonine Plague, right? So Marcus Aurelius is the emperor of Rome when a terrible pandemic hits Rome. Something like 5 or 10 million people die. It's one of the most devastating plagues in human history. But in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius says that there's actually two types of plagues. He says there's one that takes your life and there's one that destroys your character, right? And which is worse, right? And so I read that many times, and you sort of vaguely get what he's saying. And then to live in a plague, like live in the pandemic and go and see people on both sides of the spectrum just become monsters, right? You go, oh, this is what he's talking about. He's not talking about how you can breathe in the germs and then it can be bad for you. That's real. And obviously you want to avoid that. But he's talking about how, because of the stress and the fear and the danger of it, one can become a bad person, which is actually worse than getting COVID or the plague, right? Like I don't know about you, but I've seen a number of people during the pandemic where I've thought, I'd much rather get COVID than whatever they've got.
Wow.
Right? Like, that's terrible. Like, because they become some crazy person screaming in a supermarket, or they become politically radicalized in some other way, or they believe in conspiracy theories. You realize that, oh, he wasn't just a guy writing about these things intellectually, but this was based on his actual experiences. And it's only by reading and rereading as part of that daily practice that you really have the opportunity to come to understand that.
No, that's fantastic. And you do get different things when you read books at different times in your life, like Atlas Shrugged or Fountainhead. I read that so long ago. I've revisited it since many times, but I need to read it through again. I mean, that's another one. Like that's.
Well, how old were you when you read it the first time?
I want to say 1920, somewhere in there.
Right. So you didn't know anything.
Yeah.
You read Atlas Shrugged and you're like, oh yeah, they're picking on us. We're the successful, brilliant people. They're picking on us. And then, you read it in your 20s and you're like, I didn't know shit. I was a punk, and I think as you get older, the Stoics say this, that we don't step in the same river twice. Right. Oh. And that's that idea that you get when you reread. Like I just reread The Great Gatsby. I wasn't in a position to understand The Great Gatsby. And actually, I just did this whole thing. I reread Fahrenheit 451. Nice. I wasn't, at 16, I don't know what they're talking about, but in the context of that we live in today, it's totally different. And so, rereading not enough people read. And then even of the people who read, not enough of them reread.
I know. I need to go back and reread Fahrenheit 451. I read it in 6th grade, so it would have been 11 when I read it. I read it since a new edition with a new forward a few years ago. I have it. It's once again. It's on my bookshelf. Yep. Is that the cover of the latest one?
This is the 50th year anniversary.
Nice.
So when was that?
And I have my original in a box somewhere, and I need to dig it out. I've done so many moves. There's a couple books that I have not found, but I've been growing this library. Chesty, I have that one right there in your background. I got The Last Lion in mine. Yep. I have most of your books, I think, in my library, or anti-library, which I wanted to ask you about. So the idea of the anti-library is fantastic because people come in and see my bookshelves they have since I was a little kid, and they're like, "Hey, have you read all these?" And I have not read all of them, but I can go and I can grab and pull something out for reference. I don't have to go online, which is getting even more important, I think, as different maybe entities want to control what you think or do and have the power to do so. But to have your own library. And what I've done recently is I started looking, I don't know if I should say this or not, because I will, is getting encyclopedias from each decade. And just starting and seeing how things have changed over time. So you have these old ones from like the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. How is World War II? How is World War I talked about in the 20s and the 30s? How is it then in the 60s? What's changed since then? So you can kind of have this history, but this morphing history that's written down. So you can take the time to go back in those pages and be like, oh, this one from 1935. Look how it describes this. Interesting. And then look how that's morphed over time. Or maybe it's not even in something that's a little later down the line. So so that's one of my newer things now that we've moved into a new place and have some room for books.
Well, there's a certain amount of financial privilege in what I'm about to say, but I think it's really important. I've always had the attitude of like, if a book looks interesting to me, I buy it.
Yep.
I don't think, am I going to read it? What am I going to read next? I'm like, if I see it and I want it, I buy it. Because I've had the experience of books changing my life so many times that I have no compunction about taking a $10 or $20 or $200 risk on a book, right? Like if this one doesn't work out, the next one will work out. If 20 in a row don't work out, it doesn't matter because I'm so playing with house money as far as reading goes at this point that no amount of bad books in a row could ever deter me. Mm-hmm. So when people see a library, they often assume that is the cumulative total of all the books that person has read, when really it should be you said your mom was a librarian. Your mom didn't read every book in the library. No, this was a collection of all different books of all different topics that people may or may not be interested in a given time. And so building a personal library is really important, not just for you, but as you said, when you have kids, it's like, these are the books that our family owns, and pick any one off the shelf anytime you want, and let's read it and talk about it. And it's also important, I think, that people don't be so precious with their books, right? When I read, I'm writing in the pages, I'm folding them up. I don't care if I spill food on them. Like when somebody brings me one of my books to sign and it's like pristine, I'm like, you didn't read this. You say you like it, but you didn't like it enough. But when somebody shows me and it's full of tabs and there's folded pages and the spine is broken, I'm like, this person got inside here and, made themselves at home. And so, yeah, for me, when I see a book I want, I buy it. If I don't like a book, I stop reading it. And if I just feel like skimming a book, I'll skim a book. But I try to always be reading, and I'm always looking for things that can help me in my actual life.
Oh yeah. It helps me so much to have this library of fiction, nonfiction. It's organized in a strange. I have different like wars and periods here and there, and it's my own system as far as organization goes. But I go to that all the time. I'm in there much more than I am looking up something on Google. I just go to that. I'm going to that library because I know that's in there, and there it is. Boom, off it comes, and then I flip it, and I know pretty much where something is if I'm going to look it up. Especially if we're dealing with warfare, insurgencies, and counterinsurgencies and terrorism. I'm like, yep, there it is, right there, and I can fact check something and put it in the book or whatever it might be. So I love my library. It's going to be it's just a part of me, just like just my collection of weapons or anything else. It's just a part of who I am. And I love that you promote reading. I think it's, like I said, I think it's one of the most important things that we can promote as parents and as adults, and whatever our sphere of influence may be.
Well, what I try to remind people also is like, whatever it is that you're doing, chances are somebody has done it and written a book about it. And someone may have also written like a book about all the ways they failed at that thing, right? Or there might be 1,000 books about it. So it's realizing, like, when I talk to professional athletes, it's like the greatest athlete of every sport has written a memoir in every generation for 150 years, right? That to not avail yourself of that knowledge is ridiculous, right? Like, why would you not start where they left off, right? Like, so you have to make yourself a student of whatever it is that you do. And reading is the best way to do that. Of course, documentaries are great, podcasts are great, articles are great, social media is great. But I think you can attest to this. The amount of time that goes into a book, just concentrated thinking and focus and craftsmanship, there's no other medium that is as distilled down as a book. And so to just be like, I'll figure it out on my own, it's just so dumb.
Yeah, this last one, I had to go and rent Airbnbs around Park City here in Utah, and I could see our house, so I'd flip the lights on and off for the kids and look at with the binos, and just because that focus that it takes, and the interruptions are just they what kill you. But I do want to ask you a couple of things. I want to be cognizant of your time, but here's the therapy session part.
Okay.
So for most of my life, I was very much an introvert. I think I am very much an introvert still. I love just being. If I could just be in the pages of a book, and if I could just write the books in a cabin up here and send them to New York and have them published and start the next one, that would be wonderful. But I missed that boat by about 30 years. I'm not quite 30, about 20, I'll say 25, where you could rely on your publisher and publicist to do things for you. Sure. And, they'll continue to have that model for Stephen King and John Grisham and the people who had built up this readership during the 70s, 80s, 90s. But if you're stepping into it today and want to make your living doing this, and I love it. I love the writing part. But guess what? In 2022, you have to do these other things, unless you're the one-off, unless you're what
we're doing right now.
Exactly. You have to do this, but these are great. I mean, I love doing this. Sure. Because it's just me and you. And I love doing that. I mean, people listen, but it feels like they're the third person in the conversation. So I love that. But being more public, especially from my time in the military. I never had a Facebook account, never had any public profile whatsoever. I learned to be more of an extrovert, just in a leadership type role, but still try to be thoughtful in all that I do. And then when you write something like you do, that's obviously intensely personal, that you're so passionate about. And when I write, even though it's fiction, there is so much of me in there because of that
Sure.
lifetime of study of warfare, the experience downrange, just wanting to do this my entire life, knowing that after the military, I was going to write fiction in this genre. So that makes it when someone reaches out, and I use social media to say thank you to people. I'd love to be able to say thank you because I'm sincerely grateful to everybody who took a risk on me as a new author and then told a friend about it. But then you get the people who come in and just want to stir the pot or just be so mean or whatever it might be, intentionally hurtful. And so I've got this from you about there's certain things you can't control. So why let it influence your life in a negative way? And even though I know that sort of a thing and I've read about it, it still gets me and it still will keep me up. And I'll be like, so can you talk a little bit about that, especially in today's world, where kids in particular, like I'm tough enough to deal with it, even though I don't like it, and would never make a negative comment on someone else's, whatever they're doing. But people do, and it's become acceptable to complain and to just be nasty from behind the keyboard, saying things to people you'd never say if you were locked in an elevator with them, especially if they're larger than you. So we're at this weird, strange time. So I wanted to pick your brain on that. Like, how can I get better at that and not letting those things affect me, whether it's a comment or a negative review, or when someone writes something that's just untrue, or they take something that I've written and it's not at all what I meant, or something like that. Like, how do you deal with that in today's world?
It's funny. I was just watching Aziz Ansari's new comedy special on Netflix, and he was talking to the musician Frank Ocean, and he was like, I'm so jealous. Like, he's like, all these other people are out doing they're not just making music, they're doing this and this and this. And he's like, you just make music. Like, how do you get away with that? And he's like, oh, it's easy, man. You just got to be comfortable making less money. And I like that, because what he's basically saying is you got to remind yourself that you chose to do this, right? Like, you could, if like you said, you missed the boat. You didn't really miss the boat. You just chose to get on the boat that's here now, right? Like, you could live the solitary, I just send in the manuscripts, I don't care how the books do. You could choose to live that way. It would just cost you a lot, right? So remembering that, hey, I chose this, right? Like, this was my decision, and so I'm going to own it, is one thing I try to remind myself. But the other thing, and you're right, because it's a perpetual reality of any profession in the public, which is that you are judged and criticized and get unsolicited feedback from the crowd or the mob or the random internet troll. And I think you have to set up means by which, first off, just some protective barriers, right? Hemingway told Fitzgerald, like, if you read the positive reviews, then you have to read the negative reviews, right? I think what he was saying is, don't read the reviews, right? Like, you have to create some barriers. So, like, for instance, like when I started Daily Stoic, it was an email and it would go out every day, but I could read the response. People could reply and I could get them. And when it was a couple hundred people, that was okay. When it was 10,000 people, it was okay. But now that it's like almost 500,000 people, that's a lot of crazy people, right? Like, even if just 1% of the list is like the worst people in the world, that's a lot of those people, and they can't have direct access to my brain. I have a quote on my wall from Johnny Cash's manager, and he said, "You need to build a mausoleum in your head with big iron doors so that nobody can get in there except you." He said, "You have to decide for yourself what you want to do with your music and not let anyone else tell you." And so I think you do have to create a little bit of a bubble, because, like, if you wouldn't be successful if you didn't have good judgment, good taste, good instincts. So the more public you are, the more other people can get in there and mess with that compass, right? And you have to be able to protect that space, or it's not just for your personal happiness. You actually have to think about it from an artistic standpoint. Like, if you're out this is why like musicians won't listen to the radio. They don't want to hear what other people are doing, let alone what critics are saying. They want to keep their own influences pure and not get corrupted by the moment or the mood or the trend or the backlash or whatever. So I try to keep a little bit of a bubble. And then I also remind myself, as you said, and Marcus Aurelius talks about this in Meditations, if you knew what that person who's criticizing you, if you knew what they did, right? If you knew what they thought about other things, I found myself on this recently, like I was looking at the comment section of something that I knew a lot about. And I saw how wrong all the commenters were. And then like another article came out a couple of days later and I didn't know anything about it. So then I was reading the comments. I was like, wait, if these people were way off base over here,
right,
chances are they have no idea what they're talking about over here. So you just got to, I think you want to be really practical about like whose opinion you take seriously. So like you got to cultivate, you got to tune everything else out. And then you've got to cultivate like a group of people. So like we both know Stephen Pressfield. If I sent one of my books to Stephen Pressfield and he was like, Ryan, that would hit me very hard because I know I trust him and I know his taste. But if some random person on the internet gives me a negative Amazon review, I got to know like there's a reason I have this job and they don't.
Right. It's so interesting. I think I've been so open from the beginning because I looked at how like Black Rifle Coffee built something with these modern platforms you couldn't have used 30 years ago. I looked at how Apple why is the experience of getting my iPhone so different than getting my BlackBerry back in the day? Do I send out books in a very cool package that allows other people to share that experience with their audience? How does Red Bull launch a drink? Why is publishing not doing these sorts of things? So I was doing all this, but I was sharing that journey and I was thanking everyone. And I still try to late at night, I'm still hitting that heart button and I'm still saying, thank you so much. Sincerely appreciate it because I sincerely appreciate it. But when I was talking to Rogan about it, he got to a certain point. He's like, he's 9 million followers on Instagram. I can't look at every comment. So I just don't.
Yeah.
But he's like, I hope people know that I'm still very appreciative of the support of where I am and all that sort of a thing. But at some point it just becomes too much to physically do as a single person.
Yeah. Look, you got to wear your body armor. You know what I mean? Or you're gonna take you're gonna get wounded.
You put it in terms that I understand now. I like it.
Yeah. So I just, it's like to be an artist, you have to be vulnerable. You have to really care about these things, and you have to have gratitude. You have to really respect the audience and all of that. And so that's actually the reason why you have to put up some of those barriers, right? Like if you just didn't give a shit, then you wouldn't be who you are, right? It's that you care is actually why you have to put up it also, like as a leader, right? Like you have to deeply care about and be involved in all the people who you're in charge of. But if you get too close to them, you won't be able to effectively do that job, right? Like if you get involved in every bit of their personal lives, if they're involved in your personal life, now all of a sudden you don't have the boundaries that you need to be able to do your really tough job. So you have to be accessible. You have to be authentic. You have to be real and vulnerable. You can't make good art. But if anyone can get at you at any time, you're going to get paralyzed and they're going to screw with your compass and you're not going to be able to do that thing. So it's ultimately both selfish and selfless, because if you want to keep making stuff that these people like, you have to be in a headspace that's conducive to that. And if it's making you miserable, you're not in that headspace.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've never read a comment on YouTube. Maybe in the very beginning, I read like a couple, but there was not.
Those are the worst ones.
Yeah. So I don't go there anymore at all. No, I never look there. I do on Instagram. But I think it's time to take a breath. This is my year to get organized and maybe put up a couple of those barriers, change my phone number. I've had another phone for like the last 2 years and I have not committed to it yet, but it's coming. There's no other way to even respond to people that, all of them, because that's all I would do, which is a great problem to have. I feel so fortunate
Yes.
and so thankful. But I was curious what you thought about that. And then it's interesting, all this stuff that I've been learning from you by following you and reading your books actually made it into my next novel that's coming out in May, In the Blood. So I have
I can't wait.
father-son conversation, and it's the father passing along some lessons to his son. And it was just naturally, it wasn't like in my outline or anything. But I just got to this scene where I had the main character going to Arlington and then looking across at the mall and remembering this time where his dad took him to the Vietnam Memorial, and used that as an opportunity to have a conversation. And right in there, I have some of the things that I got from you about things you can control and some things you can't control. But it just naturally came in. It was, but it wouldn't have been there had I not been reading your books, had I not been thinking about the things that you're sharing with people online to make us all better, and hopefully share with our kids to make them better citizens as well. So it's powerful what you're doing is what
I'm so honored. Oh man, that's amazing. I love hearing that.
Yeah, it's
my Instagram. My Instagram trick is that I have it on my wife's phone.
Oh, nice.
So I have to be, hey, can I borrow your phone for a minute? And then she's like, give me my phone back. So I can't get too sucked in. And I can't if I'm supposed to be playing with my kids, I can't be lost in this thing because it's there, but there's just, it's like putting the cookies on the top shelf or something.
Yep. Like a little bit harder. Like I leave now, I have a separate, I always had a separate computer, and one for the business side and then one for writing, only writing. It wouldn't even be connected to the internet.
That's a good idea.
It didn't have to update Word. Those are two separate things. Then I put them in different areas. Also,
that's a great idea.
So the child has to walk across his New York apartment, which I guess is very spacious.
I'm sure it's a nice apartment.
It is.
It's probably bigger than my house.
It may be. But I did a similar thing by putting them in different rooms, just having that separation. And I leave my phone up here. But the other side of that is when I get back to it, it's like, there's oh my gosh, now I'm going to be up all night just responding to people so they don't think I've changed. And it's like, just doing the best I can. And one other thing you talk about is, how it's not what happens, but how we respond to what happens. And I love how you frame that.
To me, that's the essence of Stoic philosophy, right? At the core, it's that Epictetus, who's a slave, right? Epictetus, who ends up inspiring James Stockdale and the Hanoi Hilton. Epictetus is born a slave. He spends 30 years of his life in slavery. And so he has to figure this out, in the ultimate hard way, that there's some things in life that are up to us and some things that are not up to us. And distinguishing between these two things is, he says, the first act of the philosopher. Do I have control over this or not? And being willing to accept those things. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get involved, we don't try to make a difference, etc. We do. We just don't emote out to the world that we focus on, well, what can I do about this? If you don't like where we are politically, instead of just watching MSNBC or Fox News all day, go run for city council, right? Go try, or how about, here's an easier one. How about you just try voting? Because the number of people that complain about where we are and then don't vote is enormous, right? So the point is, what do I control in this situation? What are the little things that I can do? How am I going to move forward? That's what we focus on. And to me, that's really also, again, what a lifetime dead time is about. Yeah. I didn't choose to be in this traffic jam. I didn't choose for this, for the power to go out. But now I'm sitting here. What am I going to do with the 2 hours that I now, have in front of me?
Right. And interesting you brought up voting, because oftentimes you hear those, and I think, wasn't Eisenhower one of the most famous people that said it, that his first vote was when he actually ran for president or something like that. There's something like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of these senior military leaders, they make a point of saying that they haven't voted and they made that decision because they didn't want to be by. I don't know, because to me, immediately, it puts me a little bit on edge thinking, well, did they not appreciate all those people in their same profession who died or came home missing arms and legs or mentally traumatized from the inception of this country up until today, to give them that right? Did they think that it was, or was there just a little bit of laziness in there? And now it's convenient not to just say that I didn't want to be political because I wanted to just serve my country. I don't know. I think if you're a student of history and you take the time to understand and conceptualize what these people sacrificed for you to be able to go into that booth and vote, that you should probably do that to honor that sacrifice.
Well, and look, we do this in the country. We go it's Biden and Trump, and we go, these can't possibly be the two best candidates, right? which is true. But we also have a thing called primaries in America where we get to choose the candidates. We just had a primary in Texas. Less than 10% of the people in Central Texas voted in the primary, right? So not even like 50%, which is like good turnout in a national election. 10% of people decided, hey, here's the Democratic candidate we want, and here's the Republican candidate. 1 out of 10 people bothered to show up. It took 2 minutes to vote. 10% of people did it. And then we wonder why we get these garbage candidates. So again, also the idea, focus on what you can control. People go, my vote doesn't, make a difference. The presidential election was decided by like 40,000 votes actually. And a friend of mine here in this little town I live in, she ran for city council. She lost by 2 votes.
Wow.
2 votes.
Wow.
Right? Like 2 people said, my vote doesn't matter and didn't vote. Mm-hmm. That's a different election. Yeah. Right? And so, voting does matter and being involved does matter. And the founding fathers were students of Stoic philosophy. So this idea that the Stoic doesn't get involved or that the soldier doesn't get involved, the soldiers were the swing vote in the Civil War. Mm. If the Union soldiers hadn't gone home and voted, Abraham Lincoln does not win re-election in 1864. So the future of the country can pivot on the decision of people to decide, not to be passive and to get involved.
Jeez. Yeah, no, it's good. The voting thing. I talked to my kids about that. I self-appointed myself when I was enlisted as the voting petty officer. I was like, I got people's, what do they need from their states to do it right, and stayed on everybody. And I think that same thing I just talked with you about, I talked to the platoon about. But another part is that you talk about is when you're deciding what to do, and in the military, we call it prioritizing in the midst of the chaos. But is this essential? And I find myself stopping and thinking about that quite often. Like, is it essential that I do this? It's something I need to work on and get better at doing. Just because, like we just talked about, I'm constantly running around and people are texting me and asking me for things and more. That's happening more and more. And I'm trying to do my best to juggle it all. But I need to take a breath at some point and say, is this essential? It's taking time from my family. It's taking time from the deep thinking I need to do about the next book or whatever it might be. But is this essential? And I love how you frame that as well.
Well, I think about, you probably remember this, how earlier in your career, your life, you're like, if I just had time to write, I would be so good. If I just had time. And then you get the time, you become successful at being a writer. And what do? You start doing a bunch of other shit that's not writing, right? Because it's there, because it's lucrative, because other people are doing it. And then you don't have any time to do the thing that makes you great, right? That drives the revenue, that is creatively fulfilling, that's your calling. And so I just try to remember that every time I say yes to stuff, I'm saying no to my work, to my wife, and to my kids, right? Every time, everything you say yes to means you're saying no to something else. And so when I feel guilty about saying no to something, like I got invited to the Super Bowl this year, right? By one of the teams in the Super Bowl. I would have loved to go to the Super Bowl, but that meant a weekend that I'm not at home, right? That would mean disrupting my routine. It would have been a cool experience, but also tucking my kids in at night is a good experience. Watching the Super Bowl with my kids is a good experience, right? Being able to get up early on Monday and do the writing that I had to do, that's an important experience. And so, remembering that everything you say yes to is saying no. And conversely, when you're saying no, you're saying yes to the things that are essential that really matter.
Oh man, I love that. That's why I want to be cognizant of your time, because I know you said yes to this, which means you're not doing something else. So I'm not going to keep you too much longer, because I sincerely appreciate you doing this.
Ah, man, you're too nice.
No, I mean, I've learned so much from you, and I sincerely appreciate it all. And the other thing that you talk about quite a bit, which is something I didn't get it from this reading, but it's something I've thought about from a very young age. But if you're to leave right now, let that determine what you do. And I thought of it, people think of it in different terms. You hear that growing up, if this was your last day on earth, would you be doing X, Y, or Z type of a thing? But so I do think about that quite often, and I have for most of my life.
Well, that's the Stoic practice of Memento Mori, that life is very short, right? That none of us know how long we're here. The way that really hit me from the Stoics, Seneca said, don't think of death as something in the future, right? Like, obviously, as a soldier, death is much more present. But he says, don't think of death as something in the future, but think of death as something that's happening now. that the time that passes belongs to death. So he's like, don't think of how long you have to live. Think of how many years you've already died.
Wow.
Right. And then it's like, oh, so I'm 34. Do I have 34 years of life to show for that? Or is it more like, I don't know, 25 and I wasted 10 years, right, on various things? And so again, this helps us, I think, also what we say yes and what we say no to. If life is short, it should put the things that we should do in perspective, and it should also put the things that we don't need to do in pretty stark relief as well.
Wow. And that's another way of something else you talk about is the don't sweat the small stuff, although you use the language that that is a little more eloquent than that, but it's very similar.
Sure.
And it's something I need to think of. I think we should all think about as well. And once again, these modern influences and these devices make it so much easier to sweat those small things because they're almost designed.
All small stuff. Yes. Everything on here is small stuff. Yeah.
But it seems so big. And I fall victim to it just like most. And
well, it makes a sound, and an alert pops up.
Oh, I don't have the alert set. I've never done that, probably because I just don't know how to do it, but I need to stay away from that. But yeah, so you talk about that, which I think is so useful. And then also when you say this, and this might be in 2022, one of the most important things that I've taken away from you, and it's you don't have to always have an opinion.
Sure.
And I like that. It was so freeing to hear you say that.
Yeah, of course. I don't know what's happening, also, right. Some issues are important. Some issues are not. So I'm going to focus on the opinions that really matter. Like, doesn't what's happening in Ukraine right now make a lot of our arguments about masks or pronouns or transgender bathrooms? Doesn't it make them seem a lot less important? And I'm not saying that the people who are fighting for transgender bathrooms or for masks or whatever are doing the wrong thing. I'm just saying when something really tragic and enormous happens, like a pandemic, it should remind us how often we get caught up in trivial bullshit and we have super angry opinions about them. We're fighting as if we're being persecuted or people were mad about their flight being delayed. And again, as a speaker, you can see I'm bringing this up a lot because I travel. But you're mad about your flight being delayed. Meanwhile, these people are fighting in the streets of their country because there is an invading nuclear power, with tanks on their road, right? And it puts it in perspective.
Yes.
And just to remember, hey, I'm going to focus on the things that are important to me, that matter, that are in accordance with my values, with my obligations as a citizen. And if everyone else wants to get angry about this or that, so be it. But I don't have to be tied up in that. I don't have to get sucked into that.
Yep. I need to write some of these things down and I'm going to put them on the walls here just so that I have that visual every day because I definitely need it. Before we go, I want to ask you about your latest book, Courage is Calling. Yes. But there's another thing that's on your website that I loved as well. And it's a quote here and it says, if you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. And I love that.
I do too. That's Haruki Murakami, one of the great novelists of our time. You got to read the things like a lot of my favorite books are books people have never heard of or books that are out of print. I don't read a lot of new books, right? I want to read like the classics that I've never read or that I want to read the people who influenced the classics or the underground, One of my favorite novelists is John Fonte. I don't know if you've ever read any of his stuff, but he wrote this book, Ask the Dust. It's one of my favorite novels. But I like to read. When people are like, here's a book you've never heard of that'll like tear your face off. I'm like, that's what I want to read, right? I don't want to go, what's on the New York Times list this week and then pick up those books. I want to get my own perspective on things.
Yep. No, exactly. And I love that you have reading lists. I have reading lists. I've been doing it for like 2.5 years now. I just every month I have a few different selections for people. I choose 6 books that influence me, and I put those up there. Yours is more organized, and I like that. So I'm redoing my website soon. So I'm thinking about how best to do that with the books. But you have one on there. You have the Robert Carr book, the Power Broker, on there.
Power Broker's up there, fantastic. And the Lyndon Johnson books are somewhere. Yeah, I mean he's one of the greatest to ever do it. I mean.
And Working, insane. He wrote that more recently, but Power Broker.
Yes.
I saw that on one of your reading lists and was like, oh yeah.
So good. Have you read his Lyndon Johnson series?
No, but I saw that you had mentioned it or referenced it or
that.
something there. So just Working and Power Broker and one other one that I can't think of right now. But I love that you have those reading lists, and everybody should be going to your website and clicking on that and getting the email every day. Because it's a great reminder of things to think about or take a breath and think about as you organize and move into your day. I love that. And then people that are asking you what to read, I get that question all the time, which is why I started doing the reading list. But you have such a wealth of knowledge there with great descriptions of all these different books, why you recommend them, how they influenced you. I think it's absolutely fantastic. But your latest book, Courage is Calling, that came out a few months back. What's that one have in store?
So I'm doing a 4-book series on the cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. So the first one's is about courage, a critical virtue to the Stoics. Again, the Stoics were military leaders, and they were artists, and they were political activists. Thomas Jefferson dies with a copy of Seneca on his nightstand. So the Stoics were people who were in the arena, so to speak, right? And that's why courage is such a critical virtue to them. And so I'm in the midst of, this is my first time ever doing books that are related to each other. So I'm about to finish the second one, which will come out in the fall. But courage is the first one. And I don't know about you, again, watching what's happening in Ukraine, you see that just how contagious courage can be, and how one person can make a difference. Any other elected leader in Zelensky's place, we'd be watching a totally different story. And so, realizing that human beings can change history. And in fact, that's who's changed history throughout history. It's singular men and women who stood up and, answered the call when it came.
Yep. And I think there's something that resonates. That's why the movies like Rocky that have the underdog in them resonate. And now we're seeing that because somewhere in our DNA, I mean, as Americans, for sure, we have that in us, fighting against that superpower. In 1776, it was a different one, but it's still, we connect to those people over there that are throwing off this larger army that's invading. So I think we all are feeling a little bit of that patriotism because we're watching that in real time now. But man, thank you so much for doing this. I want to,
dude, you're the
there's
best.
So many things I want to ask you, but maybe we'll save the rest of them for another time when your next book comes out. And I sincerely appreciate you saying yes to this, because I know it means that you had to say no to some other things. So that means a ton to me, and I sincerely appreciate it.
No, dude, you're the best. It was awesome. And look, I actually do. I'm going to run, but I'm going to send you an email, and we'll do another hour. I'll have you on my podcast.
Awesome. Sounds amazing.
Sounds
amazing. Take care. Thanks for everything. Just wanted to say a quick thank you to Navy Federal Credit Union for taking such good care of me and my family over the years. I've been a member since 1996. Right there. There's my Navy Federal Credit Union Q card right there. So yeah, been a member for quite some time now. They've done a fantastic job with me and my family. And I know that investing and saving can be stressful, and Navy Federal Credit Union takes that stress away. A lot of educational materials, and they can help you get on track in 2022 when it comes to saving and investing. So go to NavyFederal.org/save and invest. Trust me, you won't regret it. Thank you so much to 6 Hour for jumping right on board out of the gate to make this podcast possible. Obviously, I am a huge SIG fan, having carried the P226 on every deployment downrange in the SEAL teams. But SIG was a supporter. They were friends well before I was a New York Times bestselling author, well before I even had an Instagram account or any social media presence whatsoever. So thank you guys all so much. Ron, Tom, Jason, everybody at SIG who gets up every day and continues to crush it and lead the way. SIG is always adapting. They're always at the forefront, whether it is firearms for citizens, whether it's firearms for our military, ammo, suppressors, optics, training, fire control units. They are doing it all, and they are always pushing that envelope and trying to do it better each and every day through innovation and adaptation. They crush. So thank you so much for that friendship and support. It will never be forgotten. Welcome to the gear highlight portion of the Danger Close podcast. So what do I have here today? So these are some new Salomon boots, and these ones here, they are called the Quest Element GTX. So you can tell these ones are a little more set up for winter. So I guess that's why they're called the Element. So these are the old ones. These are, you can tell I love these ones right here. So these are the Quests. You can tell I've been wearing these for a while. Absolutely love these boots. Yeah, there we go. There they are on the light. So absolutely love these Salomon boots. They make it into my novels, and keep an eye out for what Chris Pratt is wearing in the Amazon series adaptation of The Terminal List. He wears a few different pairs of boots in there, but if you look close, you'll be able to see some Salomons, I think. So I've heard. But look at this right here. These ones are pretty sweet because it's snowing outside. I'm going to be rocking these ones right here. See that? A little bit different, a little more weather-proof, water-resistant right there. So these look awesome. Solomon, thank you guys so much for sending these. Eric Anderson, appreciate all you do. Thank you so much. What else do I have here? Look at this thing. Boom. Look at that blade right there. So this is from Combative Edge. You can follow them on the social channels, Combative Edge, and check that out right there. You can see that in the light. I would not want to get stuck with this thing. Don't want to get stuck with anything, but look at that. That is pretty sweet. So thank you so much for sending. Sincerely appreciate that. You know how I feel about blades. Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. Find out more about Ryan Holiday at ryanholiday.net. Follow him on the social channels at the Daily Stoic and sign up for his newsletter. It's a great way to start the day. My next novel, In the Blood, is coming out on May 17th and is available now for pre-order in all formats. Thanks so much for tuning in. Sincerely appreciate it. Take care out there. Be safe. Stay strong. Keep fighting.